Joining me now, my regular Tuesday night panel, two of Australia's foremost intellects from Adelaide, columnist with The Australian, Dr Jennifer Oriel, and from Gunnedah, former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. Well, welcome back to Australia, John Anderson. Jennifer, as always, great to have you on the show. I want to start with the issue of gender debate, front and centre today with the Prime Minister in Sydney, but also religious protections back in the debate because Anthony Albanese this week visited his old high school, St Mary's Cathedral School, and was accompanied by the Catholic Archbishop Anthony Fisher. We'll get to that one in a moment. Chris Kenny, too, interviewed yesterday Liberal candidate for Warringah, Catherine Dees, and this caused a bit of a stir. Have a listen.
And I apologise for my language. I do not resile from my position.
So when you said that the gender reassignment surgery for teenagers was mutilation, that was inappropriate?
Look, that is actually the correct medico-legal term when you are looking at medical...
But you were wrong to use that language?
Look, it's very emotive. And it's very confronting and it's very ugly. So, of course, people are going to be offended. But when you look at medical negligence cases, that is the terminology that they use.
Now, on the back of that yesterday, Prime Minister and Opposition Leader were both asked about her response today.
It is extremely significant and it changes that young adolescent child's life forever.
Do you define it as surgical mutilation?
That's not a phrase that I would use.
I don't believe it is an appropriate comment, and I'll make this point. Vulnerable people, in particular, are deserving of respect.
John, we can debate the language and the descriptions, but the issue is a central one in this campaign. It's one where, you know, parents and carers, I think everyone in the country has an opinion on it, a level of buy-in, but we're allowed to debate what Catherine Dees said, but we're not allowed to debate the actual issue. That's the problem.
I think it's a real problem, and I'm aware of the research that shows that the very great majority of Australians think it's a very real problem, and in particular want the issue of women in sport settled so that sport is safe and fair for women. You can't break away from biology. But from an intellectual perspective, we've got to accept that what we've got here is critical gender theory, and critical theorists do not believe in science and biology. So that's the starting point. That sounds crazy, but they don't. Neither do critical race theorists. But it is a major issue. One of the pities is that we don't have in Australia an awareness of the Keira Bell case in the UK. She was a 23 or 24-year-old person who took Tavistock Clinic to court because she said she should have been carefully and properly counselled as to the full implications and ramifications of going on puberty blockers and then sex change therapy. And the courts, in fact, found that this was not only a live issue, that the children under the age of 16 could not make these major decisions. And yet we're headed straight down the pathway of trying to insist that the issue can be resolved by any child at any age who has a problem. Now, we all want to be sensitive, but the PM is absolutely right. We need to be aware of how big and how significant these issues are, and we need to have a civilised and sensible conversation about it. The polls indicate that the Australian people, it lights up like a Christmas tree. They are concerned. The elites are out of step with the strident ideology that they're pushing.
Yeah, and look, just on that point today, claims by some of the journalists in that press conference with the Prime Minister that gender reassignment cannot and doesn't happen in Australia to anyone under the age of 18, well, they're wrong. Here's a tweet from the Australian newspaper's specialist writer in this area, Bernard Lane, who makes the point, and he reminds me today that there are family law cases where girls in particular have been allowed under the age of 18 to proceed with a mastectomy in order to begin a gender transition. If we can debate difficult topics, Jennifer, I think respectfully by and large, as we did, like same-sex marriage, why can't we have this conversation in Australia? Why can't voters be treated as adults? Why does it have to be shut down all the time?
Well, we're dealing with ideology here. It's not rationality. It's not about truth-telling. It's about upholding an ideological worldview. And that worldview has come from a body of thought from began in the late 1970s, early 1980s, called queer theory. And queer theory was quite different to, I've said this before, it was quite different to gay rights, lesbian, feminism, and so forth. It really advocated, the theorists from that school of thought really advocated for what some feminists at the time described as the fringes of sexual behaviour. And transgenderism came through that line of ideology. So when you try to counter ideology with truth, you're up against a deeply irrational school of thought and people who really support it. Now, we know that even if there weren't surgery being performed, that hormone blockers, puberty blockers, can result in irreversible damage to reproductive systems, so that it becomes very difficult if a teenager were to decide when they were 18 or 21 or 30 that they really didn't want to proceed as a young adult with a sex change or transgender surgery or any more treatment. They're in a difficult position. So when you talk about irreversible medical treatment, you don't have to get to surgery with transgenderism for that to be brought about. And it's dangerous. You need to be able to talk about it, and people need to be given an informed choice, and parents need to have a say. It shouldn't be the state deciding.
Yeah, and going back to John's point there about remorse down the track and an inability, particularly with women, because of the damage to your fertility, to reverse it as easily as perhaps men can. John, just on the issue of religious freedom before we go, Labor said it's committed now to legislating protections for religious freedom. It's campaigning hard to secure the religious vote. We know it matters in places like Western Sydney. Can voters trust Labor here?
Well, I'm not sure that I do, but I would make this point. Because the media has covered the debate in the Parliament so poorly, people think that the Parliament did not support the Religious Discrimination Act. It did, strongly, very strongly. The issue that derailed it all was the introduction of proposed changes to another act, and ironically a Labor Act, the Sex Discrimination Act. And so the Labor Party really needs, I think, to be consistent and say we supported what was put before the Parliament and essentially stick with it.
Jennifer?
Yes, I think Labor isn't for an anti-detriment provision, which basically gives people of faith one of the best protections from vexatious complaints. So we know from the way that people have been treated in Australia in the past, that they're hauled before anti-discrimination commissions and so forth. And the most positive thing that we could do is ensure that they're on an equal footing under federal law, so that they have defence against damage to reputation, loss of livelihood and so forth. And that isn't happening with Labor. It won't happen.
All right. We will watch it all closely. As I said, 12 days to go. Jennifer Oriel, John Anderson, thank you as always.